If you would like to know my experience working for the NHS versus working for private companies, and you would like to draw upon my experience to inform your decision making, then please keep watching this video. So I've currently worked for private companies for at least 4 years, and I've worked for the NHS for the past year of my career, and I'm drawing upon these experiences. So today I'll be comparing working for the NHS versus working privately, mostly my experience, but a little bit of the experience of my co-workers slash colleagues slash friends. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is what is classed as NHS, what is classed as private. Being an NHS employee mainly means that you're working under the NHS. The NHS is your employer, and it's usually people working in hospitals or working in PCN, so primary care network, or the CCG, clinical commissioning group. And I'm talking in context of working as a pharmacist. And there might be other examples of working with the NHS that I have not mentioned. If you know any, please list them in the comment section. And working privately could be working with private organizations. So for example, Boots, Lloyds, Day Lewis, private chemists. And I would also class being a GP pharmacist as private, because GPs are contractors to the NHS, just the same way pharmacies like Day Lewis and Lloyds are contractors to the NHS. So if you're a GP pharmacist, I would say that you are privately employed, because these GPs are run by partners, GP partners. Okay, so now that you know the difference between NHS slash private, now let's go into what are the differences. So what is my comparison on different key points as to working with these two different entities. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is work-life balance. So with the NHS, I find that I currently have better work-life balance compared to working with private organizations. And this makes a little bit of sense because you are employed and you have your times that you're employed to work. I feel like there's less pressure as with private companies as to work outside your working hours. With private companies, they're very profit driven in a lot of cases, so they're trying to make sure things are running, make ends meet, and make everything run well and get as much profit as they can. So sometimes they will require you to work extra hours, and you may not have that much of a work-life balance. At least in my experience, I felt like I have better work-life balance with the NHS because I only have to work within my hours, and if I did work any extra hours, I definitely get paid for it. The second thing I will touch on is career progression. So with the NHS, I feel like there's literally, the world is your oyster when it comes to career progression. You could go from one band to another, or you could even decide to go onto a completely different career route. Once you're with the NHS, it's easy for you to just access so many different career routes if you want to, which is still under the NHS. You just probably need to get a little bit more training to go in the direction that you're looking at. And you can also climb through the bands in the NHS as long as you undertake additional training, which the NHS is happy to fund. I find that with private companies, there's not much room for career progression. There is some room, don't get me wrong, but it's not as wide or as vast as you get with the NHS. In this case, I find that I prefer the NHS career progression to working for privates, just because there's just a lot that you can do on the NHS if you're not happy where you are. So the third thing I will talk about is the pay. So I think private definitely pays a lot more, and this is because they're making profit and they obviously want to retain you, so they're paying. The NHS is not necessarily making profit, so NHS is funded by taxpayers' money, so they have to allocate it efficiently in a way that it doesn't break the bank, if you see what I mean. So the NHS pay scale is actually by bands, and you are restricted within a certain limit depending on what band that you are as to what you will be taking home. So I feel like with private, there's a lot of wiggle room for negotiating your pay, and there's a lot of wiggle room for earning high amounts of money. If you're working the work, you can take home the pay that matches the amount of work that you're doing. But with the NHS, there's very limited amounts of wiggle room in terms of your pay, so that's something to consider depending on how important the money is to you. So the next thing is training and development. So I feel like with NHS, There are training and development opportunities in that the NHS is willing to sponsor you and fund certain courses slash degrees that you decide to undertake, as long as it's related to your particular career, and as long as your like lead pharmacist slash chief pharmacist agrees for you to do that, the NHS should hopefully have funding for you to undertake that. Just make sure that it's relevant to what you're doing and it's going to take you to the next level. But with privates, they usually have like trainings, but they're internal training. So a lot of private organizations structure internal trainings, which is really good, because I found that my first few years of qualifying, I benefited a lot from having that internal structure of training. But what I found was, when I wanted to now do an external course, it takes a lot to be able to get funding from private companies to be able to do external courses. I mean, I've been with the trust for a year and I've already spoken about potentially getting my PhD at some point in the future, and they have okayed it as long as it's within their scope and within what I'm doing for the NHS. So those are the two comparisons. Now, I can't exactly say which one I think is better, because I did enjoy having internally structured training courses, but then it's also nice to have the opportunity for funding from the NHS, and it's not that hard to get it from the NHS compared to how it is with private companies. So the next thing I'll talk about is pension. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm only going to say a few words on this. I've done a little bit of research and I believe that the NHS offers more in terms of the pension scheme compared to private. So you obviously would pay some of pension out of your earnings, while your employer would contribute as well to your pension pot. So I believe that NHS contributes a better amount to your pension pot. I'm not going to say the exact figure I saw online because I can't guarantee that that's correct, but I could see that NHS has a better percentage that they would add to your pension pot compared to a private company compared to the private companies that I have worked for in the past. The next thing I will talk about is maternity pay. So I'm currently on maternity leave, which is why I'm recording at night, because I literally record at whatever time I get to record. Anyways, that's by the way. I am currently on maternity leave, so I'm well versed with what they do because I did read into it when I was about to go on maternity. So depending on how long you've worked for the NHS, that determines how much you will be getting in terms of your maternity allowance and maternity pay. So I only was with the NHS for about a month before I fell pregnant. I know. But I was still entitled to 6 weeks of full pay, and then the rest will be statutory maternity pay, and then 13 weeks of unpaid leave, which in total is an entire year. And I believe that if you've been working for the NHS for longer, I believe about 4 or 5 months before you do fall pregnant at least, you will be getting 8 weeks of full pay. I'm just going to read the rest of it here. 18 weeks of half pay, and then 13 weeks of statutory maternity pay, and then 13 weeks of unpaid leave, which I believe is a very generous offer. With private companies, one which my friend worked for, I believe they paid her 3 months of full pay, and then the rest of which was maternity pay. So just depends on what you feel like works for your situation. In this case, I don't think I can like say which one I feel is better than the other. In this case, I feel like this worked for me well, because if I was with a private company and I fell pregnant a month after starting, I don't think I would have been entitled to the maternity pay, because I believe with that other company, you had to have been working for them for about a year before you're entitled to maternity pay. So yeah, that's that on the maternity pay. Next thing is bonus. So the NHS does not offer anything in terms of bonus. They don't offer bonuses at all, because they're obviously spending from a public pocket. They can't be giving everyone bonuses. But if it's a private company, they're making profits, and if they're able to hit their profit margin and even surpass that, then they can share bonuses. I definitely did benefit from a good amount of bonuses when I was with the private company. So that's something you might want to consider dependent on what's important to you. The next thing I'll mention is team working. With the NHS, because you're working as part of a massive organization, you have the opportunity to work with different teams. You have the opportunity to have like multidisciplinary experience. So you work with nurses, matrons, different people depending on what sector of the NHS you're working. It's actually quite nice to just have that multidisciplinary experience, whereas in a private setting you might be limited to who works in your organization. And in community pharmacy particularly, as a pharmacist, you probably would only be limited to working with your team members, which sometimes ones might include another pharmacist, and in a lot of cases does not include another pharmacist. So you find that it can be a little bit isolating. So if you're someone who would like to like rub minds with other professionals, then it might be worth considering where you will be getting a job if there's like that multidisciplinary team approach to, you know, problem solving and just everyday work. That brings me to the end of this comparison video. I hope you have enjoyed this, and I hope it has given you a little bit of an insight into how I felt about working in these different settings and these different sectors. Personally, if I had to choose, I feel like it will depend on where I'm at in life. So currently I feel like the NHS job fits perfectly with what I'm doing currently in my life, because I've currently got a daughter and I need that flexibility and that work-life balance. And the maternity allowance worked so well for me in that I got pregnant really quickly and I was still able to get some maternity pay, and generally I'm able to like benefit from doing a diploma that's now funded by the NHS. I've been told that if I wanted to do a PhD in future, the NHS could potentially fund it. I love the team that I'm working with, and I'm able to work with different specialties. I work with heart failure nurses, with nurses that go into the community. I work with rehabilitation teams, you know, so many people. So I currently work with different specialties, and it just broadens my horizon in terms of like learning. But at a particular point in my life, I wanted the money and I wanted a job that would pay better than what I'm getting paid right now, and private was the way to go. So just, you know, weigh everything and see exactly how you feel about these different things that I've mentioned, and just choose what works best for you in your situation. I wish you all the best in your future endeavors, and I'll catch you in my next video.